So we've been looking at negative externalities and how do we solve that market failure. So in our previous video, we looked at excise taxes and we looked at what we call a sin tax that we have on alcohol and cigarettes. This is an excise tax. And of course, you'll recall that an excise tax, where did that go? I seem to have misplaced my slides. Okay, I don't know where that went. But an excise tax is a tax, interesting, on it's per units produced. So it's not a percentage, it's a fixed amount that is equal to the external cost. So other examples of excise taxes would be things like the carbon tax that we have seen at a provincial level in Canada, as well as currently they're looking at having a federal carbon tax instead of a provincial one, since Alberta had a carbon tax and then removed it. So these are excise taxes, way to internalize that negative externality, the impact you're having on people who are not the buyers and the sellers. Well, excise taxes are not the only option for dealing with those negative externalities. Remember, the goal here is that the quantity in the market, demand, supply, this quantity is based on the impact only to the buyer or the seller. So we want to find a way to consider the impact on the rest of society and get the quantity to go down. So there are other ways to get the quantity to decrease. So the second solution we have to external costs is the idea of legislative controls. In this case, the government puts a quota on the amount that a company can produce. So if we're looking, for example, at a company like Nova or Dow, okay, they are a petrochemical plant and they have emissions, so they do burn-offs periodically. Perhaps you see the flares going off, and that is the burning of emissions. So there is this pollution that they have when they produce their product, their polyethylene, polypropylene plastic pellets. So one option to help deal with the air pollution is to have legislative controls. The government of Alberta could say, hey, Nova, you are only allowed to make X number of kilos of plastic pellets. That's it. So we could put a quota on the production levels. Do you think that would go over well? Probably not. We pride ourselves in Alberta and Canada and the US. We pride ourselves on academic freedom. Let's try that again. How about economic freedom? Academic freedom is in universities and colleges. How about economic freedom? Economic freedom is the ability to choose what people want to do. So the problem with putting quotas on production levels is now you are limiting people's ability to be successful as a business and decide for themselves what is profitable, how much to make, and what to make. So the downside to legislative controls is that they reduce economic freedom. So another option is to put a quota on the level of pollution. So we say to Nova, okay, you can produce as much as you want, but you're only allowed X amount of pollution. Okay, so what do? Well, we need to monitor the level of pollution coming from the company. Well, near Red Deer, we have Nova, we have Dow. So if we see air pollution off in the distance, it's difficult to tell whose pollution that is. So determining how much pollution and whose pollution can be problematic. So the second challenge with these legislative controls is it can be difficult to monitor. It's hard to know who's doing what. Well, we could put in monitoring devices, right? We could, so detecting the amount of particles in the air right at the site where the emissions are sent out, right? That we could do that monitoring. It becomes more costly as we have to monitor each and every location and different type of business. But we could do it. But then the third challenge we have with legislative controls, besides the reduced economic freedom, difficult to monitor, the third challenge we have is that it does not create an incentive for these businesses to go beyond the minimum standard. So yes, you're keeping the total amount of pollution down because you've set a quota, a maximum amount they can pollute, but there's no real incentive for a business to pollute even less, right? It's not beneficial to them in terms of a profit standpoint because all they have to do is meet this quota amount set by the government, which is why economists like this third solution. And the third solution creates a secondary market where you can buy and sell pollution permits. This is cap and trade. So perhaps you've heard of cap and trade. There are a number of different instances where cap and trade is used. So let's start with one that Canada created. Okay. So perhaps you have heard of the Kyoto Protocol. The Kyoto Protocol was an agreement that Canada set with a number of countries that would use cap and trade. So what would happen is that we would set a limit on the total amount of carbon that globally we could produce. Okay. So we're going to set a limit on the global amount of carbon pollution. Sorry. And then what would happen is that we would take that total amount that collectively we were allowed to pollute and chop it into permits. So there's a certain amount of pollution that per permit. And each country would get a certain number of permits. The idea here is that then if you want to pollute more, you can buy permits from others. And if you find more cost-effective ways to produce so that you are more environmentally friendly, so again, incentive to go beyond the minimum, you could then pollute less and sell your permits to others. Now, the challenge with the Kyoto Protocol is that US and China refuse to sign. And these are the two largest emitters of carbon pollution in the world. So if your two biggest polluters won't agree, then it's not really going to work. So even though Canada created the Kyoto Protocol, we left it in 2011. Well, in 2015, we joined the Paris Agreement. All right, I'm at the edge of my writing. So we joined the Paris Agreement in 2015. And again, the Paris Agreement, like the Kyoto Protocol, was about reducing greenhouse gases. The difference between the Paris Agreement and the Kyoto Protocol is that the Paris Agreement gave people options. Option number 1, a carbon tax. Option number 2, cap and trade. Okay. And in fact, within each country, you could choose cap and trade or carbon tax. And in Canada, when we signed the Paris Agreement, we had some provinces like Ontario do cap and trade and other provinces do the carbon tax. Now, since then, we have seen a number of provinces, Ontario, Alberta, try to get away from having either cap and trade or the carbon tax, which then, if we're going to continue to abide by the Paris Agreement, means that federally we have to have cap and trade or the carbon tax. And that's what's being fought in the courts right now, is whether Alberta needs to have a carbon tax either provincially or federally. Now, if it's provincial, then the provincial government gets that tax revenue that we see there. If it's federal, the federal government gets that tax revenue that we see there. But economists like cap and trade even better than carbon taxes. And the reason that they like the idea of cap and trade is because we don't have to have as much government involvement, because we're leaving it to the markets. There's a secondary market. So let's look at how the secondary market works. There's also a great video that I have linked to this video, or you'll find in Blackboard, that explains how cap and trade works. Really great video that someone else created. But if we walk through the carbon trading or cap and trade process, the way that it works is step one is that there's a total amount of pollution allowed. So we set a total amount that all collectively we're going to stay under. And the next piece is that we take that total amount and we divide into permits. Okay, so a certain amount of pollution per permit. Then what we do is allocate among all the parties the permits. So you have a certain amount of pollution you are allowed to emit. The rest is left up to the secondary market. So we have demand for permits, and it is downward sloping, because the more expensive the permit, the less companies or countries can afford it. And the cheaper the permit, the more countries or companies are willing and able to buy. But the supply of permits, remember we took the total amount of pollution, divided into permits, the total supply is fixed. It is a vertical line because it does not change with the price of the permits. So when we look at then the price of a permit, it is solely based on what is happening with demand. So if your country or your company wants to grow, you want to expand your business, and expanding your business means producing more pollution. You're growing your economy, which means more production, which means more pollution. So if you need to produce more, or if you're going to produce more, and that means you're going to pollute more, then you need more permits. But it's your choice. So there's that economic freedom. And what that means then is you could choose whether or not you are willing and able to purchase more permits. And the more companies or countries want to produce and so pollute, the more it's going to make the price of the permits go up. So if you need more permits, demand will increase, and we know an increase in demand makes prices go up. But if you are a country or a company that finds a way to be more efficient, that has a way to be more environmentally friendly and pollute less, then the benefit to you is that you can take your permits and you can sell them to others and make money at it. So if you need more permits, demand goes up, that drives up the price. And here, if you need less, you can sell your permits and make money. So the reason economists like cap and trade is that it resolves some of the issues that we see with legislative controls. Remember, legislative controls reduced economic freedom. Well, here you can decide whether you're going to pollute more or less. It's your choice. And there's an incentive to go beyond the minimum standard, because if you find a way to produce that has less pollution, you can actually profit from it because you can sell your permits to other companies or countries. And so economists like the idea of cap and trade because we're leaving it up to the market and individuals to decide what's in their own best interest. All right, so let's go back because we started this conversation talking about solutions to negative externalities. One is an excise tax. Option 2 is legislative controls, but we know that has challenges. And option 3 is a secondary market for permits. Which we often, outside of economics, call cap and trade.